This film was made mostly in the 1945-46 season and was put together from a series of random shots taken of erosion. The first shows parallel sandhills in the country north of Butte, but similar shots could have been taken of much worse areas in the Murray Mallee at that time. The horseman is Errol Rollbush, a former member and chairman of the Murray Mallee Soil Conservation Board, and at the time a member of the Advisory Committee on Soil Conservation. We now see some panoramas of the Murray Mallee in that year, where it was very difficult to find any grass cover at all. This is Harold Hanslow from Victoria, who was a very active farmer and the donor of the prestigious Hanslow Cup for soil conservation in Victoria. We now see severe water erosion in the red-brown earth country between Yakka and Jamestown. In the 1945 drought, the area of bare, scalded land was very extensive, resulting in high runoff and flooding. On several scenes, we see massive gullies with cultivation retreating. Now to the marginal lands north of Hammond on the Willocra Plain, which was a complete dust bowl at that time. The land had been broken up into farms which were too small, and most of them have since been abandoned. To attempt to get some cover back, in 1946 a lot of the land was sown again with a cereal crop. And as you can see at that time, horse-drawn steel-wheeled combines were still the order of the day. Returning to the Mallee, a lot of farmers were making more out of scooping their own sand off the railway line than they were making off their farms. And the railways were spending something like £10,000 to £20,000 a year hiring farmers at a couple of pounds a day just to scoop sand. But even this wasn't sufficient. They had to use bulldozers as well to keep the lines open. This scene shows the country about 5 or 6 kilometres southeast of Karoonda on the Pivinga line. Again we see Mr. Bob Herriot, Mr. Hanslow and Mr. Thompson, who was later the chairman of the Soil Conservation Authority in Victoria. Driving around the Mallee at that time presented an enormous problem. Almost every road had a blockage of sand drift over it. Mr. Herriot is showing the depth of sand removed by indicating the length of exposed Mallee route. Now we're looking over some drift country with Mr. Bruce at Karoonda. He was one of the first to grow perennial veldgrass in the Mallee. We now have more shots of this type of drift with the very rough country that developed due to the removal and pile-up of sand. The car, by the way, looks like a 1939 Ford V8 coupe. Then as now, the main stabilising plant for sand drift was rye corn. It was planted on the loose sand, but was not much use on the blown out areas which were very, very infertile. It was not until a few years later that superammonia was used instead of just straight superphosphate. The man filling the drill is Jack McCabe from the property just south of Wanby. The area that he's drilling is a continuation of the big sandhill along the south of the Wanby Research Centre. This was surrendered to the department for a soil conservation reserve in return for a pro rata reduction in rental. You'll notice that horses were very good draft animals for this type of work because they were less likely to get stuck than a tractor. They're using a disc drill here, which is contrary to our subsequent experience that a combine with its rear tines removed is the best implement. The drill didn't leave the surface ridgy enough. As you can see, The rye was moderately successful in places, but it was a drought year, and at that stage we weren't using sulphate of ammonia as well as superphosphate, so consequently there are gaps in the rye areas, where a combine and sulphate of ammonia could have filled a lot of those blank spaces. Another plant which we felt had a good deal of promise and did quite well on sandy land was evening primrose. It's not of any great importance now, but there was quite a bit of it sown around the end of World War II. We also felt there was a big place for pipgrass. Mr. Cowan near Murray Bridge planted a lot of it just to the east of Murray Bridge on the Corinda Road, and you can see how strongly staliniferous it was. However, it required a patient, persistent man like Mr. Cowan to really get it going. Our efforts at Wanby were not successful. We planted quite a lot of it on big sand hills using student or cadet labour. The person working so energetically is Alan Moore, then a cadet, now Dr. Alan Moore with the CSIRO. We now see an oat crop being cut for hay in the Mallee, probably near Wainaka. You can see that 3 horses and a binder was still the usual haymaking method. We turn now to the granitic soils area immediately west of Palmer, where the drought of 1943-45 caused a complete disaster. The area was blown out. It was subject to very high winds, and the sharp, heavy granitic sand destroyed what vegetation there was, resulting in both wind and water erosion. Contour furrows were tried and did a reasonable job. But the following year, when the season changed and we had heavy rain, very heavy storms, a lot of the furrows were cut through and damaged by the runoff. However, they did a reasonable job. In 1946, a more successful machine was used, the Sunprong. This was originally designed for renovating lucerne. It consisted of a series of rotary tines that just scratched up the soil, leaving no furrows in any direction. The department bought the tractor and this machine and hired it out to farmers in the area to sow seed and fertiliser. It could be driven among the rocks and left no distinct tine marks to lead water away. As you can see, it was quite a narrow machine and very manoeuvrable. Here again, we see Mr. Herriot and Mr. Thompson walking through the seeded country. The tall man with the bald head is Bob Baker, who was in the department for many years until he retired in 1983. The rye grass did very well, and there was also some primrose and clover sown, which did quite a good job in reclaiming a lot of this country. Where the sand had blown across the hills and accumulated in deep drifts, we decided to sow rye corn with the same machine, and this was also fairly successful, providing sufficient cover to allow regeneration of pasture. Up until 1946, very little superphosphate was used in this area. Returning now to the red-brown earth country, we had very many more active gullies than you can see at the present time. The country was being cropped on a fallow wheat rotation, and severe rilling and gullying were widespread. Heavy summer rains in 1945 and early 46 sharpened all the gullies. A number of these shots were taken near Bullaroo Centre, some on the property of Mr. Borges. Now we have a number of scenes with the foreground contour furrowed and in the background a lot of gullies. This is Sid Norwood's property at Yakka. Here Mr. Herriot is demonstrating to Mr. Henslow how the soil structure has collapsed. The surface soil is completely sealed, causing very low infiltration and high runoff. There's a very thin skin of compacted clay on the surface. With high runoff, of course, you very soon get incipient gullying, resulting in extreme gully head erosion. This water, rather like thick tomato soup, is the Light River at the Linwood Bridge south of Tarlee. During the 1945-46 summer, a series of thunderstorms brought more than the average rainfall in a lot of northern districts. One of the first farmers to take contour banking seriously and protect a large proportion of the vulnerable part of his farm was Stan Moore of Jamestown. He bought himself a small grader ditcher. The department used to hire these small machines out for 2 shillings a working day, but Stan brought his own so that he could work when it suited him best. He was one of the few tractor-owning farmers at the time when the International Harvester Company held a series of field days and demonstrations on the Turretfield Research Centre, where a lot of the contour banks were built at their expense, demonstrating that ordinary farm equipment could be used to build those banks. A disc plough or even a mouldboard plough could build contour banks. International Harvester demonstrated that this could be done, although rather inefficiently, except when using one of their double furrow disc ploughs. The mouldboard plough used was heavier than anything used in wheat growing at the time. This double furrow disc plough was quite a heavy machine with 2 large discs about 30 or 32 inches in diameter. We brought several to hire out to farmers on the same basis as the graders, that is, 2 shillings a working day. A good deal of Turretfield, particularly the paddocks to the northwest of the office, were done that way. Now we see a series of shots of systems of contour banking, probably at Borgus at Bullaroo Centre. Here again is Mr. Herriot, driving his Ford V8 down Moore's Waterway. Not a good thing to do, but of course it was pretty well covered with lucerne and probably quite safe to do at the time. Harvesting between contour banks with horses was a major problem. Here we have 3 machines working together on Mr. Philheinches' property near Yakka. Mr. Heinches had 2 of the very popular Mackay Massey Harris 8-foot machines, which were the commonest harvesters at that time. These are followed by his then brand new Horwood Bagshaw machine, driven by power takeoff from a tractor. This is the machine with which he opened up the crop between the banks. The horses could then come through without trampling it down. This tractor is probably a Cletrac, driven by Mr. Heinches. Sitting on the header is Murray Heinches, later a local committee member and now member of the West Broughton Soil Conservation Board. These shots were taken during the 1945-46 harvest. We used to say that you shouldn't survey more than 100 acres on one property at any one time, but because of the number of people working on this farm, we surveyed a 200-acre paddock in 2 or 3 days. The banks were built on the whole 200 acres in a few weeks. Contour furrowing was one of the things that we strongly encouraged in those early days, but now have largely abandoned in the cereal districts. On Larwood's property at Yakka, there were a lot of very big gullies which we had to keep water out of at all costs. We put contour banks where we could and then put contour furrows in between the banks. We also ploughed some contour furrows on Turretfield, and this shot of scattered gum trees with furrows in between is taken on the hilly country to the southwest of the headquarters at Turretfield. The farm-haul tractor which we saw previously at Palmer was used. It was equipped with a hydraulically operated 2-way plough. Hydraulics were just being introduced in those days. They were quite an innovation. The tractor driver is Ken Larwood, who we saw earlier. After heavy rains on Fred Pedlar's property next door to Larwood's, the land eroded right down to the clay subsoil. This was contour furrowed, some of the earliest done by the department, and was quite effective. It held back a lot of water, as can be seen. Eventually, we started to get some growth back on that scalded land. This grass is in furrows on fairly steep land owned by Stan Moore, above his first lot of contour banks. It was furrowed to protect the banks below. In 1946-47, we started working in vineyards. These first vineyard shots are west of Clare on land belonging to the Stanley Wine Company. The erosion in this area is quite shocking. And you can see how quite a few of the vines were undermined by erosion, and production fell to a very low level. Subsequently, Stanley's contour planted nearly all their vineyards. At the Blackwood Experimental Orchard, they used to cultivate 30% slopes, mostly up and down, and severe water erosion occurred in the mixture of pear and apple trees. The rope is being joined from one tree at another at what was believed to be the planting depth of those trees. Something like 15 inches of soil had been lost between the trees. One of the earlier contour planting jobs that we laid out was for Penfolds at McGill. They made it look quite interesting and spectacular by putting in a white peg where every vine was to go. As a result, the contour lines and the layout can be seen quite clearly. It created quite a bit of interest at the time. The man in the picture is Jim Rounseville, the first engineer ever appointed to the branch. By 3 years of age, these vines were looking quite good. This was a replanted area filmed in about 1948-49. The man walking towards us between the vines is Alan Bear, formerly soil conservator with the department. Winsett Modbury also did a lot of contour planting around about that time. And as you can see, it was still the era of the horse. The horse-drawn French plough was used to work close to the vines, and they proved you could trellis a vine on the contour. They also used hydraulically operated ploughs on hydraulic linkage, which preceded the now popular three-point linkage. The tricycle tractor came and went within a very few years. The final shot is of some of the contour planting at Wynn's property. The manager at the time was Jock Williams, who had formerly been the viticultural instructor at Roseworthy College. We did a certain amount of contour planting of the trees at the Blackwood Experimental Orchard. This was a block of young apricot trees, again long since gone, but they did quite well on contour lines. The film ends where it started, with a series of shots from all over South Australia, of conservation scenes, of contour banks and contour furrows. The yellow ones are a turret filled with sourshops on the banks. Another shot of Stan Moore, still building his banks. Ken Larwood, still putting in his furrows. And finally, Jack McCabe, still seeding his sand hills.